So for those of us joining today, I would first like to start by saying hello and welcome to our joint training on the topic of the Shape ID Toolkit. We're very happy to welcome you here today, as well as to welcome our, I would say, the organizers of this event, Shape ID, who will be taking the next couple of hours to inform you about what we believe is going to be a very informative and helpful tool in the process of supporting SSH integration in Horizon Europe. So, for those of you who may not remember, we just want to go through a couple of housekeeping rules with you for today's webinar. And the first thing that I wanted to mention is that this event will in fact be recorded. In particular, for those who were unable to attend, we're going to make sure that we have this video available at the Net for Society website after the event. Another point that I'd like to share with you is that we would like for you to pose any questions that you might have for our speakers today in the specific Q&A section or function of this webinar. For those who want to make use of the chat, we ask that you use the chat in order to say hello, mention where you're from. But if you have a question, which we will be addressing throughout the course of this event, we ask that you please put your questions along with your name and hopefully your organization so that we can identify a little bit of who you are and better orient the questions and answers when they are posed. Okay, so as mentioned, today's event is really focused on helping all Horizon Europe, NCPs to better understand how best they can support the process of SSH integration, as this is continuing to be a very important cross-cutting issue in Horizon Europe for the European Commission, as well as for us as NCPs in our daily work. And in order to help support this process, we have collaborated with the Shape ID project, which has been very active in the area of SSH integration, in particular as related to the social sciences, humanities, and the arts in Horizon 2020 to learn better about what it is that our various communities need in order to better be involved in this process. And for that purpose, they have developed what they call an SSH integration toolkit. And so we've decided to put together this webinar today, and this webinar is really broken down into two essential components. For the first half, we're going to have two presentations that are going to focus both a little bit on the development of the toolkit, where it comes from, and why Shape ID decided to do so. And then that will be followed by a live demonstration of the toolkit. We're going to then close the first half with a 15-minute Q&A session, which is why I mentioned, please, when you have any questions, to include them in the chat. Then, to continue into the second half of the webinar, we're going to go even a little bit further into the actual usage of the toolkit to better understand what specific resources are there for NCPs. For this purpose, we're going to then entertain 3 different presentations, and these presentations deal with what we've decided are really quite important areas for NCPs to know about. And for this purpose, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Isabel Fletcher, Ms. Darren Wallace, and Professor Catherine Lyle. These are all members of the Shape ID project, and Ms. Lyle, she is Professor of Science and Public Policy at the University of Edinburgh, and she has been really quite intimately involved in the development of this toolkit. She is the author of a book by the name of Being an Interdisciplinary Academic, How Institutions Shape University Careers, as well as co-author of Interdisciplinary Research Journeys, Practical Strategies for Capturing Creativity. Ms. Fletcher, she is a Senior Research Fellow in Science and Technology and Innovation Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She herself is a qualitative social scientist, and her research has really been based in science and technology studies, but she really works hard to incorporate approaches from sociology and food policy into her research. And then finally, we have Ms. Darren Wallace. She is the project manager for Shape ID, located at Trinity College, Dublin. She has a BA in Fine Arts Photography and a PhD in Media, and has previously worked in research development at Trinity University. After Shape ID, she will once again return to this role and really focus on building capacity for collaborative research. So those will be the three topics that we will be looking a little bit more deeply into: the role and values of AHSS in interdisciplinary research, which is the art, humanities, and social sciences, guidance for university research offices, and evaluation or evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research. We'll close this second half as well with the Q&A. And then before we really come to an end, we would like to make you aware of the fact that we are offering a 30-minute interactive session for which we will then post the link to at the end of the second half of this webinar. So on that note, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Lyle for her first discussion of the pathways to SSH integration.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're very pleased to be here. I'm just sorting out my remote control here. I'm just going to give you a very, very quick introduction to the toolkit. I think you really want to hear from Darren when she's demonstrating the actual toolkit. But before we do that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Shape ID project so that you can understand how the toolkit has been developed. This is a coordination and support action under Horizon 2020. And as such, part of our job over the last 2.5 years has been to understand the state of the art in terms of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary integration in European funded research, to identify any gaps in our understanding and hopefully to fill those gaps. In order to do this, we've had 6 work packages as part of the project, starting with, as I said, an understanding of the state of the art, conducting a literature review and survey as part of work package 2. We then moved on to 6 learning case workshops where we worked with stakeholders in order to co-produce recommendations for integration involving the arts, humanities and social sciences. And work package 4 brought all of that evidence that we gathered together in the form of a validated knowledge framework. And that really provided us with the foundations for the toolkit. And Isabel, Darren and I have been the team leading the toolkit development. All of this information you will find on our website. As you might imagine, there have been a number of deliverables. You will find all of those, all of the reports and the policy briefs on the Shape ID website. We're now in the final stages and we are delighted to be able to speak to you today as part of our communication and dissemination of this toolkit. Sorry, the advance is a bit slow. What we were aiming to do with the toolkit was really to inspire and motivate those who'd not so far been involved in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. People who maybe were a little bit hesitant, a little bit nervous, but to try and demonstrate the value and the benefit of this type of research. At the same time, we were looking to give guidance. So a second key goal was to inform and instruct quite a wide and diverse range of different users. So what we're trying to do with the toolkit is provide guidance and signposting so that people with different levels of knowledge can readily access the information that they're looking for. We'd like to think that our unique selling point, if you like, with the toolkit is that it's placing a much more targeted lens on the contribution of the arts and humanities and social science disciplines. And Isabel will drill down into this in a bit more detail in her presentation. We've specifically included a lot of bespoke short guides and discussion tools, and you'll see those in the demonstration. And at the heart of the toolkit is a guided navigational system so that we can hopefully get people to the information that they need rapidly and easily. I've talked a little bit about the evidence base. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into any further detail. You saw the introductory diagram slide, which explained the structure of the work packages. We benefited greatly from the input of our expert panel member, and I think really saw a step change in the development of the toolkit based on their advice. And that encouraged us to include a lot of new and quite bespoke resources, which you'll learn more about in the next hour or so. So the key features of the toolkit is that it's providing a gateway both to new and existing resources. We know that there's a wealth of information out there about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, but often it's quite disparate, it's quite hard to get hold of. So what we're trying to do is pin that information down for users. We're doing this through what we've described as guided pathways. Often people don't know what they don't know, so the structure is that we have small clips of information to elaborate and introduce a topic, leading on to further resources, and you'll see this structure in a moment. We provide different entry points depending on the user's role, depending on their search strategies, their interests, their level of knowledge. And I said a variety of different resource formats, including a series of downloadable guides. We've tried to design this for sustainability so that it will have life beyond the work package, the project that's funded. You'll see more of this when we do the live demo. But I first of all wanted to show you the idea behind the different user pathways. We have 4 targeted partner groups, if you like, for the toolkit. We recognise that it will be useful to individual researchers, but also to research organisations, to university research offices, for example, for research funders and policymakers and people like yourselves who are acting as brokers and intermediaries in this process, and also for a wide variety of societal partners beyond the academy who these days are often involved in research. So we're seeking to answer a number of core questions with the toolkit. We're seeking to explain to people what interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research is all about, how to do it, how to create those collaborative conditions and collaborative partnerships in order to co-create an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research project. And we also have a lot of information here in terms of how to fund, support and evaluate ID and TD. And you can access these different sources, sets of information through the guided pathways that Darren will be showing you in just a moment. We've set it up according to a series of drop-down menus. So if, for example, you're interested in funding collaborative research projects, you would then go to that section, a menu will open up, and you can then drill down into, further information. But I think that will be more effective once you see the live demo. I also mentioned that we've designed it with a number of different search strategies in mind. You can go into the toolkit and look at our frequently asked questions, which will then signpost the user on to different sources of information. We have a sitemap where you can access everything that's within the website, and you can use these different drop-down menus to find the material that you need. And I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Darren, who will give us the live toolkit demonstration. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm just going to share my screen now and begin the live demonstration. Okay, so Catherine has explained pretty well the aim of the toolkit in the context of the overall project, which was to provide pathways to better do and support inter and transdisciplinary research for a range of different stakeholders, including researchers, funders, policymakers, research organizations, and societal partners. So we've gathered together a lot of existing resources. This is the website homepage. You can watch some introductory videos about the toolkit and about how to navigate it from the principal investigator, and some other discussions around the role of the humanities and the challenges institutions face. But the main point of access, the homepage provides a point of access to most of the ways into different resources in the toolkit. So we've, as Catherine has mentioned, we've got guided pathways. We've created guided pathways which allow you to enter the toolkit by role or by topic. I'll show you those in a moment. And then we've also got access to our sort of resource collections, our top 10 tips, case studies, a set of downloadable guides, entry into the frequently asked questions, and a number of guided tours that we've begun to develop for different user groups. So I'll go into guided pathways first. I think it's one of the areas that is most useful for, say, newcomers who are, as Catherine says, not sure what they don't know necessarily. So we've made it possible for people to navigate the toolkit based on their role or the goals that they're interested in. There's points of access for research individuals, research organizations, research funders and policymakers, and potential societal partners. And each of these essentially filters some of the goals that I'll show you in a moment. So for researchers, we guess that researchers might be interested in some of the goals, like understanding, developing a project, co-creating with other partners, improving their research skills or building a research career. For research organizations, for example, supporting collaborative researchers might be particularly important. And for funders or policymakers, funding or evaluating might be particularly important. So if we take a look at the goals section, these goals were derived from the project work. So Catherine showed an overview of the project and our activities. So from our review of the state of the art and our consultation with stakeholders, we synthesized all of our findings from these activities to draw together what we felt were the most important sort of preconditions and how to address the most important challenges that people faced in trying to do or support or fund inter and transdisciplinary research. So these 9 categories here are essentially goals that people might want to undertake, and they're informed by the research that we conducted to identify the most important challenges and to create pathways for addressing those. Let me take a look at a couple of these, a couple of examples here. I'll focus on a couple of examples. I think there's a lot of different reasons, I suppose, that this might be of use to NCPs. On the one hand, as representatives of funding agencies, you might be interested in funding and evaluating collaborative research. But then obviously your role also involves providing information and passing on information about resources and training and all of that to researchers and research offices. So we'll take a brief look maybe at support collaborative researchers as well and co-create a research project. So if I go in first to fund, so as Catherine said, we first introduced the topic very briefly without going into too much detail. This leads to one of our, what we call our goals pages. Essentially, this is a series of curated resources. So the resource highlights section basically highlights, first of all, it includes many resources that we've created ourselves. So we've got both curated resources coming from a lot of other sources, and we've got resources that we've produced ourselves to kind of provide quick access to these for beginners in particular. So you can have this kind of quick access looking at top 10 tips or questions to ask when approaching a particular topic. Then you can drill down into the rest of the material available under this topic. So for example, our top 10 tips for developing inter and transdisciplinary research programs highlights important points like the need to build incremental steps into developing funding programs, for example, through seed funding for network building. Also points like using accessible jargon-free language to invite different perspectives. And then this can be used in conjunction with our reflective tool for research funders. So this provides a list of reflective questions to consider when developing a funding program, such as whether a full spectrum of disciplines and sectors and experts in inter and transdisciplinary research approaches were actually involved in the design of the call, things like how the call frames societal problems and how open or closed this is, and what the applicant is asked to explain about their interdisciplinary approach or understanding, whether that's clear. So we also include a case study. This is also under our case study section, but we include a case study of the Irish Research Council, which provides quite a nice example from a small national funder on providing seed funding for network building and small project funds for capacity building to help build capacity, and particularly in leadership for the HSS community. And then we link also to one of our policy briefs where we go into more detail about the language, the importance of language in funding calls. So then some of the other key resources under these kind of green accordions, we've curated resources that come from both the project and elsewhere. So for example, things that come from our literature review or survey or workshops. Let me see, co-design funding calls, for example. So you can open each of these, and under these we provide access to different kinds of resources, including some of these are shape ID resources, and some of these, for example, this useful blog post from Swiss transdisciplinary researchers and funders, on how funding programs can better support this kind of research. So if I go back to guided pathways, I'll just show you a few of these so that you get an overall picture of some of the resources we think are useful for you. So evaluate, resources for evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research. Catherine will discuss evaluation in a little more detail later, so I'll just show you this so that you have a sense of where the resources are, what kind of things we have available. So first of all, our guide on evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research from Shape ID partner Christian Pohl provides a concise overview of some of the challenges and good practice, also with a list of further reading to kind of dive down deeper into this topic for those who are interested in developing evaluator guidelines. And we've also got developed a reflective tool for reviewers of inter and transdisciplinary proposals, which can be used in conjunction with the top 10 tips again. And this provides questions reviewers can ask themselves about things like how the problem was formulated, the diversity and suitability of the disciplinary mix, the inclusion of a stakeholder engagement plan, and many more questions. So it's relatively short and accessible kind of way into some of the kind of important issues to consider when evaluating. We've also got this this nice interview from Kimberly, who was kind enough to discuss with us the challenges of evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research in Horizon Europe funding programs. And then we've got another resource, another top 10 tips, this time on evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research, which highlights some important points for evaluators, such as things like the need to be conscious of their own biases, their disciplinary biases, and to be open to a range of quality criteria, and the need to consider the validity of arguments for an interdisciplinary approach, how that's necessary, and also the feasibility of the interdisciplinary approaches described, including how familiar the applicants are with interdisciplinary methods and whether they've taken these kind of considerations on board. So in addition to these resource highlights, we've got, again, a series of curated resources based on topics we felt were most important for for addressing these challenges. For example, good practice in inter and transdisciplinary evaluation compiles quite a lot of different resources that have been produced by experts, researchers and funders over the years that try to identify the important aspects of doing evaluation. So let me see, I think if I go back then to guided pathways. Another one I wanted to show you was, I'm not going to show you them all, don't worry. Another one I did want, I think I'm going to show you two more and then a few more final resources. So just be another few minutes here. So supporting collaborative research. So as the Commission say, I'm sure you've heard the Commission talk about SSH integration in Horizon Europe, and it's still obviously very important. But one of the things they point to a lot is that it needs to happen at local level as well. So universities need to build a better culture for interdisciplinary research. So we think this our section on supporting collaborative researchers may also be of interest to this group. So some of the resources we include are a reflective tool for higher education institutions who wish to support inter and transdisciplinary researchers. And this, it encourages university decision makers to consider their existing supports to help them identify areas for improvement, asking, for instance, what training is provided to support researchers in acquiring the skills they need for collaborative research, about the kind of the structures and organizations of themes or research themes or structures within the university, whether any internal funding is available to help researchers develop networks or explore new ideas in collaborative contexts or build teams, and also things like, larger institutional things like how well recruitment and promotion criteria evaluate collaborative researchers, or whether they're disadvantaged by the existing reward criteria within universities. We also include an institutional case study. This is of the Trinity Longroom Hub where I work, which is an arts and humanities research institute that has been working for the past 10 years to slowly try to develop a culture of interdisciplinarity and support arts and humanities researchers in moving in that direction. So this is one of our case studies which tries to give, I suppose, some inspiring ideas about good practice and how this can happen in that kind of a space. So with good practice tips from experience, lessons learned, such as really the need to understand that culture change takes time, the importance of engaging core stakeholders and building a community around your efforts, and building on existing academic strengths so that you're not, in a sense, trying to shoehorn researchers into, interdisciplinary pathways when they're not willing. So to kind of work with researchers carefully to kind of, make sure that there are pathways, viable pathways, and that there's support for people who do want to go in that direction. And we see, so scrolling then to resources, again, we have a number of resources curated under each of these topics that are identified as important, related to career pathways, education and research, supporting capacity building, and there's lots more that you can look into in more depth there. We also have an interview with a former provost of Trinity talking about some of the things that university leaders can do. And I will talk about the guide we've created for research development offices later on in the second section of this. The final resource I wanted to show you here was Co-Create a Research Project, because as we know, there's a huge pressure there's increasing pressure to bring partners from outside of academia, for researchers to work with partners outside of academia, particularly in Horizon Europe calls where they're very impact focused, and it's important to engage partners from enterprise, civil society, citizen groups and others. And it's not only a matter of kind of stakeholder engagement through communication and dissemination, but often of sort of deeper communication and deeper co-creation and actually partnerships in research projects. So it's the latter that we really focus on here with curated resources on partnering with groups outside of academia. So some of our curated resources are around why societal partners might want to take part in research, for example. And this is really about the, I suppose, the why this is important, and recommendations on developing collaborations with artists, creative practitioners, citizens, enterprise, and the voluntary sector. And some of the other, so we have sections on each of these individually as well. And then some of the resources on the end might be particularly important, I think, because there are a lot of tools out there to promote stakeholder engagement and knowledge sharing between different kinds of partners. So here we include links to other toolboxes and handbooks for engaging societal partners with lots of useful questions, tools, methods, and so on for approaching such collaboration. So I'll go back to guided pathways. Do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah, we're currently at 2 after, so I would say you have a couple more minutes, sure.
Okay, a couple more minutes. I won't push my luck. I'll just show one or two more resources. So if we go back to the homepage, yeah, just to briefly flag what else we've got. In a sense, we've touched on top 10 tips, case studies, and some of our guides through the guided pathways, but you can also access these directly. So for example, top 10 tips page collects all of our resources. At the moment, I think we've got 2 aimed at funders, one for developing and one for evaluating interdisciplinary programs or projects, and 4 for oriented more towards researchers. So developing careers, writing interdisciplinary proposals, working in multi-stakeholder collaborations, and also working with policymakers. So these are, again, developed by the Shape ID team, drawing together sort of, best practice from the literature and from their collective experience as well, because obviously we have some of the, we're fortunate to have some of the world leading experts in transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research on the project, like Catherine Lyle, who's here with us and who has literally written a book on interdisciplinary careers in academia, and Christian Pohl, who is one of the leaders of the Transdisciplinary Lab in ETH Zurich, who would have a lot of experience working with societal partners and with developing methods for co-creation. We've also got a series of case studies that we've curated, or basically created ourselves. So we've got case studies. We've really tried to, Isabella's going to talk more about this, so I won't say a lot, but this is the case studies section. We have research project case studies, for example, the Atlas of Holocaust Literature, where we have a case study and a video created for one of the Shape ID workshops, showcasing collaboration between digital humanities scholars, designers, cartographers, historians, and lots of other different kinds of stakeholders. We have, I won't touch on some of the ones Isabella's going to talk about. Another interesting one is, for example, the Roritage Project, a collaborative European level project, which is coordinated by architects at the University of Bologna, and includes partners from SMEs, public bodies, research and education institutes, and developed plans for turning 6 rural areas across Europe into laboratories to show how natural and cultural heritage can act as engines for regeneration. And it's, got the arts and humanities disciplines involved in leadership roles and in the co-design of the research, which, is an interesting, I think, case study in showing how problem framing can be very different when arts, humanities and social sciences can lead and not just play tokenistic roles. So natural and cultural heritage were in this project understood as part of a broader set of cultural ecosystem services, including festivals, landscape management, sustainable food production, and migration. So it's, it's just one of the nice examples of what happens when you can have AHSS leadership in a project that is not just about, something that's traditionally arts and humanities oriented. And we've also got a couple of case studies on organizations. Yes.
I apologize to have to interrupt, but I need to ask you to please come to an end now, since we don't have that much time for the Q&A, and I'd like to try and stay on schedule if possible.
Absolutely, no problem. Thanks, Kimberly. Everything else is fairly accessible there anyway, and you can also look at everything, as Catherine said, through the sitemap. So I'll stop sharing and hand over to Kimberly for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so very much, Darren, as well, Catherine, for these really informative presentations, in particular, that very comprehensive deep dive into this toolkit. On that note, I would then like to now turn to the questions which have been coming in. Currently, we have 4, so I'll just start and go through the list as they come in. The first is from Michaelis, and he asked Professor Lyle in particular, if you could please give the project's definition of inter and transdisciplinary research. So what is it?
Michaelis, Kimberly, you will see that we are all smiling at this question because it was a very thorny question. It's not one that's simply answered. We could spend the rest of this webinar discussing it. What I will direct Michaelis to is the section in the guided pathways on understanding inter and transdisciplinary research. There are many and multiple definitions. Very simply, my approach is interdisciplinary research is something that crosses discipline boundaries, and transdisciplinary research crosses sectoral boundaries, if you like, excuse me. But Darren was very much pushing us as a good communications manager to give a single definition in our policy brief. And of course, all the academics in the group were saying, no, it's not possible to give a single definition. But that very broadly is a distinction that we make between inter and transdisciplinarity, whether there are different stakeholders from different sectors involved. But I would direct Michaelis and all of our guests in the audience to the very comprehensive section of resources that we've put together specifically on this topic.
Great, thank you very much for that. A second question which we've received concerns any potential plans there are to maintain this toolkit in the long term, in the future, and also how to build on this toolkit in the future. So it wasn't posed to any one particular individual, so I would say I'll open it up to the floor.
I can start to answer that and say that we really want this toolkit to have longevity. Having put quite a lot of work into it, we don't want it to become a kind of another dead website. We are looking for people to host it because we're aware that the kind of the problem of project funding, where this project is funded till October, we'll get hosting for another year, but it needs an institutional home. We'd really like the EU to take it on. We think they would be the best host for it, but we're open to suggestions. Should I say anything else?
Well, I think in the meantime, it's going to be hosted by the Trinity Longroom Hub, Darren, isn't it, for the next year? But this is very much part. We have a no-cost extension on the project until the end of October, and this task is very much uppermost in our minds. Is how that we ensure the sustainability of the website. And in terms of feedback, we would love your feedback. And we have a web address, which perhaps Darren can pop into the chat. So we would love your comments and feedback. And we are still working on a few additional guides. For example, at the launch, one of our panel members suggested we might do one on mentoring, how to mentor interdisciplinary career, early career researchers who are working in this way. So there are a few more things coming, but yes, definitely open to suggestions, but within the limited time that we have still available on the project.
Yeah,
we have a wish list for the future as well. So if your suggestions are too ambitious for us, we'll consider them and may put them on our future desires. But I would say that the whole process has been very iterative in developing it, and we have benefited from a lot from our expert panel's input and from some critical friends' input. We've quite consciously tried to take on board feedback from an early stage, and it has improved the toolkit enormously.
From the point of view of sustainability, just I suppose in brief, our plan is currently to maintain the toolkit as it is on the at Trinity, hosting at Trinity. We also will archive everything in its current form and archive it on Zenodo. We have a Shape ID community on Zenodo. So that will make the current version of the toolkit available essentially in PDF form. We'll have, archived collections of the resources from each of the pages that I was showing you, and we'll have our collections of our top 10 tips and our case studies. But this is obviously it's a static resource, that's the equivalent to producing a PDF report. What we really love to do is have the opportunity to actually maintain it as a dynamic living community resource so people could continue to contribute to, and that somebody, but obviously for that we'd need not just a sort of a basic baseline sort of funding to host it, which is not very complicated, but somebody to actually keep it alive and maintain it and liaise with the community and do these kinds of events essentially. So we're still looking carefully at all of our options there, whether it's applying for further funding or whether it's finding institutions or groups who might be willing to support it in the future.
Great, thank you all very much for those responses. So an additional question which has come in is, what do you all think might be the best way actually for this guide to reach those for whom it is intended, in particular those outside of the SSH community who are perhaps new to the topic of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity? And in particular, do you have any specific tips that you could give to us as NCPs on how we could support this process, probably in addition to signposting that the toolkit actually exists in our events?
Shall I start off on that one? I mean, I think we're very grateful to have the opportunity today because we see you as a kind of key conduit in your role as NCPs to help us disseminate this information. And I think we would like to be guided by you in terms of what else would be sensible for us to try. In the next 3 months before the end of the project, we are arranging a number of one-to-one meetings with national funders. So far, we've spoken to the Norwegian Research Council, to the Dutch and the Swiss Research Council. So we are doing that kind of targeted one-to-one discussion. And we're also organising some sessions, which we'll tell you a little bit more about at the end of the presentation, for the upcoming ITD conference, which we also will help with our dissemination. But yes, I think we would very much hope that the NCP network would embrace the toolkit and encourage the people with whom you're working to also use it. But yeah, we'd be very open to other suggestions that you might be able to make today or later in conversation.
If I could just say something about that. One of the presentations we'll have after this session, I will be showing a resource that we developed for research offices, and I think that might help answer that question as well, that it kind of shows you, it'll talk through some of the challenges we see in helping to prepare researchers to embark on interdisciplinary careers and journeys and to write interdisciplinary proposals. So I think we'll probably flag a number of resources in the course of that, and that guide in itself is possibly a good way to disseminate information through research offices for NCPs. I think also there's one of the things we address in that is the question of how to promote EHSS integration among researchers and to research offices. So again, that should hopefully address some of the question in more detail.
Great, thank you. So we've got two more questions that I'd like to cover before we move to our next session. And first comes once again from Michaelis. Thanks for being so active today. And he would actually like to know what, based on your analysis as a project Shape ID of ASHA, or I should say ASSH, my goodness, integration in the framework programs, what have been actually the biggest, the largest barriers to actual meaningful integration?
So I'm going to talk a bit about this briefly in the next section, but I think the kind of, I would identify from our research two of the biggest barriers are kind of interlinked. A lot of these issues are framed very technically. So they're framed as a problem that can be solved by science and technology. And therefore, arts, humanities, and social sciences researchers don't see where their expertise can contribute. And vice versa. And also, so STEM researchers don't also see the kind of the flip side of that. They don't see the roles that the arts EHSS can play. And that's one thing. Linked to that is the language that's used in calls. If you close down a problem and make it and frame it entirely as a technical issue, then it kind of exacerbates this sense that there aren't obvious roles for I don't want to say non-STEM, for art, humanities and social sciences to play in this research. So it's fairly obvious if you're researching borders and security that a key component of it is what people feel about security, what makes them feel secure. But if you do it in terms of data or management of borders, then it closes off a richer and probably therefore more meaningful understanding of the issue.
This came out in one of our workshops, one of the learning case workshops that we ran at Edinburgh, where often it's the language of the funding calls, that they're framed in very un-AHSS friendly terms. And so this isn't necessarily something that NCPs can influence now in terms of Horizon Europe, but how we work with future research funding programs to ensure that the arts and humanities, social sciences have a voice right at the beginning when those calls are being framed. And I think so it's a systemic problem. There isn't one straightforward answer to that, I think. But yeah, definitely as Isabel's described the situation.
Great, thank you both. So the last question that I'd like to address comes from Elizabeth Osinski. She is a Cluster 6 NCP in Germany, and she asked what would actually be helpful to support the maintenance of this toolkit. And do you actually have any idea what the Commission's position might be in regard to that?
I guess so far the Commission has seemed interested but not made any commitments. So I mean they've in a sense, we've spoken to Harold Harton's unit. They're obviously overseeing SSH integration and the monitoring of that. They're interested, and we're meeting with them again hopefully later this month. But nobody has sort of offered any sort of firm pathways or commitments to funding. So we're still looking around for how to do that and how to influence that. I mean, I suspect that if anything could be helpful from the point of view of national funders, I mean, national funders' testimonials or supports are sort of, something that would, I suppose, express support for the need for such a thing, and a desire for the Commission to support the ongoing maintenance of a toolkit like this, I think could be valuable, because we're still trying to make that case to the Commission. But the mechanisms, I suppose, for how we do that are a little obscure to us, so we're just trying to have conversations with people. If anybody, I mean, a lot of you work in European policy where you know the Commission on a lot of different levels. If you have advice for us on how we can, I don't know, unlock any of those mechanisms that might be in existence that are obscure to us mere researchers, we would be very grateful for any such advice, obviously.
Thank you. So I'd like to now close this first Q&A session so that we have adequate time for the remainder of the webinar, and that each of our next three speakers, I should say our current speakers, have an opportunity to go through their presentations without necessarily having to rush. So on that note, I would like to once again turn the floor over to Darren.
Thank you. I think actually Isabel is going to speak first.
Sorry, that is correct. Excuse me, Isabel.
Yes, it's me. Thanks. I'm going to try and keep this quite brief because I think I'm basically I'm adding to points that Darren has already made. Can we have the next slide, please? So I wanted to talk about the role of and value of AHS disciplines in inter and transdisciplinary research, to highlight, both to fit in with the theme of SSH integration in the title of this training session, but also to highlight some, in a bit more detail, a few of our resources. Next slide, please. This is one of our downloadable guides. And it's based on the synthesis research we did that also fed into the toolkit. It outlines 13 distinct ways in which the arts, humanities and social sciences can contribute to inter and transdisciplinary research. And we wrote this partly because there was a demand, a kind of unmet demand for this information. I was personally, as a social scientist, I was quite surprised, but there were a lot of people saying, well, what can the arts, humanities and social science contribute to this kind of challenge-led research? So can I have next slide, please? So this is the kind of background context. As I'm sure most of you are as aware of this as I am. I just wanted to present this briefly. Challenge mission-oriented research has historically been STEM-dominated, inter and transdisciplinary research also. But the move to integrate first the humanities and social sciences and then the arts, humanities and social science, it has been going on for more than 5 years. And one of the key points was the Leiden Declaration. And now I am not going to talk about the integration processes that the EU has developed and continues to use, because I'm sure you're more aware of them than I am. But there's a kind of ongoing monitoring process. Topics are tagged, and there's the annual report showing the hours and the money devoted to specific disciplines within Horizon 2020. And I'm assuming the same process will go on with Horizon Europe. But this kind of uncertainty about what the arts, humanities and social sciences can actually contribute seems to be persistent, which is why, as I said, we produced this guide. Can I have the next slide, please? So this word cloud comes from our list of the 13 roles. It's a way of illustrating it. If you want to read more about it, you can of course go to the toolkit and download the guide. It's I think a 2-3 page PDF. But I want to pull out, so there's things about the acceptability and risks of new technologies. Those are quite well recognized roles for particularly the humanities and social sciences. There's also things about public engagement, again, quite well recognized. But there's what we've been touching on when we talked about the wider framing of problems, starting from human experience rather than scientific or technical perspectives. There's also the role of identities, behaviors, and meaning making that is really crucial. My central research area is around food and diet and nutrition. What people eat matters to them, not just because of the science of nutrition, but also because of their identities. What people eat is part of who we see ourselves are. So this is one of the reasons why dietary advice doesn't always work very well. And that's just one very specific example. And there are also ways in which the arts and humanities in particular create new knowledge and use techniques that are specific to their own research. I'm thinking of the study of representations and the use of narratives and the engagement with emotions. These all give them a much wider role than has often been seen within kind of challenge-focused research. And I wanted to, can I have the next slide, please? Illustrate this with two of our case studies. As Darren said, we produced this because there was a demand for concrete examples of arts, humanities, and social science-led research. And there didn't seem to be very many examples, existing examples that we could point to out there. So we created, I think we've got about 9 research projects, some institutional case studies and some funding case studies. And I'm going to give a really brief snapshot. The first one is AHRC and UKRI funded research on chickens in everyday life. One of the co-eyes for this was Naomi Sykes, who's at Exeter University, I want to say. And it's a research that came out of social science interest in how humans and animals live together, but then developed to span archaeology and genetics and development studies. And my favourite bit of this is part of the research was done in the UK, part of it was done in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, one of the research fellows went around collecting chicken bones so that after Ethiopian Christmas, so the genetics of the chickens being consumed could be analysed. So this case study, and you can read more about it if you download our brief account of it, shows how the AHS can identify questions to be answered within collaborative research, and also pull out the wider implications of this research for poultry keeping, both in the UK and in Ethiopia. Can I have the next slide, please? The second case study I want to pull out is KPLEX, which was conducted in Trinity College, and it's digital humanities scholars looking at how big data and looking at how big data deals with research, and particularly humanities research, and talking about how the complexity of this research gets lost in many big data approaches. And this is a really clear example of how AHS specific expertise can interrogate STEM-driven research fields. It's a really important example because we know that AHSS research gets treated badly in a lot of repositories of journal artists, for example. AHS research is disproportionately underrepresented. And I'm going to stop that and go on to the final slide, please. At least I think this is my final slide. So I finally wanted, having produced the downloadable guides and the case studies, I wanted to highlight that we have policy briefs and our recommendations follow directly from the kind of material I've been talking about. So 2 key recommendations related to AHSS integration are to promote sociocultural missions and challenges. So this research needs to be driven by sociocultural questions, not just scientific and technical questions. And second, the AHSS experts need to be involved at the very beginning of the framing of the research. This is where the language and the framing are kind of complementary issues, and this is where a wider range of people need to be involved in developing this research and framing the research questions. And I think I'm going to stop now, and Darren can take over and talk about the guide for research managers.
Thanks. Who's got control of the slides? Is it Quiva or?
Yep, I have control at the moment. If you want to take it, you can, or you can just tell me to move on.
No, it's fine. I'll just ask you to move on. It's probably quicker. We're running a little behind, I think, so that would be perfect. So yeah, if you could just move on to the next slide, Quiva, that would be perfect. Thanks very much. So I'm going to introduce a guide that we've developed for university research development offices, which offers a path through the toolkit based on challenges in supporting researchers to build capacity for interdisciplinary research. Next, please. So we know that interdisciplinarity and SSH integration are very important to success in Horizon Europe, particularly Pillar 2, and they're considered essential to developing on the expected impacts of this very impact-driven program. So building inter and transdisciplinary capacity really matters. And if you've heard the European Commission talk about SSH integration recently in the context of Horizon Europe, you'll know that they emphasize all the time that capacity building really needs to happen on a local level, so that universities need to actually build capacity locally in order to enable researchers, to prepare researchers to participate in and lead interdisciplinary research in Horizon Europe, and very much the case for SSH integration. So next slide, please. So we hope that the toolkit will help researchers facing this situation and help. We've developed a guide to key resources in the toolkit for research development professionals. So this is one of the resources you can use to navigate the toolkit yourself and also to share with your research community. You can access this as a PDF through our downloadable guides page under topic guides. Next, please. So as we were finishing the toolkit, we wanted to see how it could support research developers in their daily roles. So I worked with my colleague in Trinity, Maureen Burgess, who's a research program officer for the Arts and Humanities, to identify the kinds of practical challenges people in those roles faced. So firstly, we looked at the challenge of building a pipeline. How can research support professionals prepare researchers for inter and transdisciplinary research by developing skills and leadership, enabling encounters, helping understand career risks and pathways, and promoting interdisciplinarity and SSH integration within their universities. And then secondly, how can they support researchers working on collaborative interdisciplinary proposals like for Horizon Europe? So faced with tasks like building a team, working to jointly develop ideas, planning and writing for impact, incorporating the right stakeholders, and considering how integration will take place across the lifetime of a funded project, what resources are needed, and so on. So I'll run through briefly what we've curated under each of these sections. So next, please. So for each of the headings that we've identified as challenges, the guide presents the challenge informed by Shape ID findings and summarizes some key resources from the toolkit. So firstly, on the skills needed, interdisciplinary research requires kind of meta skills like leadership, communication, and integration. And we include links to a number of guides to help understand and develop such skills. Developing interdisciplinary proposals, a guide by Catherine and colleagues in Edinburgh, looks at the skills and attributes for ID and TD researchers. They need to be adaptable, curious, open, have good communication and teamwork skills, and be comfortable with ambiguity, for example. And another guide from the University of Edinburgh on leading interdisciplinary initiatives identifies leadership attributes like enthusiasm, vision, reflexivity, and good people management skills. The TDNet, which is the Swiss network for transdisciplinary research, also a partner on Shape ID, have also produced a really excellent MOOC. Not Shape ID didn't produce the MOOC, but our colleagues did. And this is really interesting for researchers trying to learn about transdisciplinarity. It introduces transdisciplinary concepts and methods through in-depth case studies, mostly in the context of sustainability, but they're very transferable. And then there's further resources related to this in our Improve Research Skills section, which was one of the green goals grids that I showed you in the Guided Pathways section. Next, please. So helping researchers to build interdisciplinary networks is also hugely important for collaborative research. And fostering informal encounters is particularly important for beginners because it helps them to explore the idea and develop an interest in interdisciplinary research and start to learn how to communicate about their research to other researchers from other disciplines or people from other sectors. So some of the resources we link to here are quite an interesting article on the difference between different kinds of encounters. So for example, cultivation encounters where you are maybe just setting up meetings to explore ideas, or versus say development encounters where you're actually trying to begin a collaboration or start working on a project or proposal. And really emphasizing how clarity of purpose on this can help determine event features like format, numbers, participants, and other aspects of the meeting. We've also produced our own guide on the reflective tool for higher education institutions, which I mentioned, which helps universities consider what supports are already available and whether there's a need for better supports to build capacity. And other resources are under developed collaborative conditions within the toolkit. Next, please. So academic career paths, publication pathways, and funding opportunities still really privilege disciplines. And it's important to recognize that interdisciplinary careers can be risky for researchers and to be open about this when working with them to develop capacity. Emily Whallen's guide from the University of Edinburgh includes notes and reflective questions for early career researchers to help them work through this process of thinking about an interdisciplinary career. And Shape ID's guide for those considering collaboration allows them to consider what they hope to get from it, whether a project requires an interdisciplinary approach, and other kind of relevant questions for just shaping up to it and thinking with researchers. It can be used in a sense as a discussion tool with researchers who are thinking about embarking on that path. And we have also a top 10 tips on developing interdisciplinary careers, which is, I think, useful for this context. And further Shape ID resources on this are in our section on developing a career in inter- or transdisciplinary research. Next, please. So as Isabel's discussed, I'm not going to say as much about this, but the role of the AHSS is often quite poorly understood and is often tokenistic rather than true integration. So we have produced the guide Isabel talked about on AHSS contributions. We've also got links under our understanding section to a lot of other case studies, such as the Net for Society fact sheets on SSH STEM integration in Horizon 2020, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Because there's quite a lot of resources there that we feel can be used to help showcase and promote the potential of SSH integration within universities. But I think it's also important to identify where it's already happening within your universities. If you're a researcher, or if you're an NCP, maybe at national level, what are the good national examples? How can you create your own sort of collections and portfolios of case studies that showcase good examples at national level? I think that can be very motivating and inspiring for people who are considering it. Next, please. So then moving on to supporting proposal development. Obviously, building teams is really important for interdisciplinary research, and it's really important. It's come up time and time again in Shape ID's work and the work of others. It really takes time to build relationships and to establish trust. It's a really essential foundation for good collaborative research. So we include some resources that are helpful for understanding how to build a team and how to facilitate processes that can help build mutual understanding and align expectations. So the guide, one of the guides we include on building and managing teams outlines challenges and tips for building a team, including the value of building social aspects into brainstorming sessions and the potential of group writing sessions to help teams coalesce. Another guide we include is from the US National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, which provides a lot of concrete, detailed guidance on different aspects and phases of facilitating interdisciplinary meetings. And then the TDNet toolbox is a really valuable resource. It includes validated methods organized by research phase on identifying things like who to involve, roles, tasks, responsibilities, and workshop approaches for working through things with groups, aligning expectations, hosting multi-stakeholder discussion groups, and lots more. And further resources on that in the Shape ID Toolkit are in our Develop Collaborative Conditions section. Next, please. So it's very important in interdisciplinary research to involve all partners, including the AHSS, from the beginning in framing problems and developing ideas and approaches to avoid tokenism. So I think what Isabel has discussed and some of what we've mentioned before has emphasized that and indicated some of our sort of case study examples to help reveal the potential, or showcase the potential of more meaningful AHSS leadership or participation. So some of the tools we include to kind of support this process are, for example, an exercise taking the form of an imaginary case study or play, which is used to stimulate discussion on what makes for good collaboration, produced by one of Catherine's colleagues in Edinburgh. Also, a wide range of tools and methods with reflection and discussion on their use are available on the Integration and Implementation Sciences website and blog, and also in the TDNet toolbox, which I've mentioned before. Next, please.
Darren, I'd like to remind you that you have 2 minutes remaining.
Okay, great. I'm almost finished. So there is, as you know, in Horizon Europe, there's increasingly a need to collaborate with stakeholders from enterprise, civil society, and other sectors. And we include some resources for approaching this. For example, we linked to the European Commission Guide on Communicating Research for Evidence-Based Policymaking, which is specifically focused on how SSH researchers can do this. The Biodiversa Handbook, produced by a European project, is a practical guide for researchers trying to identify relevant stakeholders to engage with to increase impact. And it includes both nice case studies and really clear guidance on how to think about this. Another issue can be things like authorship when it comes to working with people across different disciplines, and the credit taxonomy provides useful guidelines on thinking about different author expectations and roles, which can be a discussion point, if not a sticking point, in publishing collaborative research. And again, these are the kind of things it's worth really thinking carefully about and discussing from the outset early on in a project, and making sure that they're built in to the processes of running a project, as well as developing a proposal. Next, please. And this is my final slide. And so one of the final things we emphasize in the guide is that integration needs to take place across the project lifetime, so not just proposal writing. So it's very important to design the project implementation plan with this in mind, and this is very important when writing project proposals. And we include some guides to help with this. Building and managing interdisciplinary teams from the University of Edinburgh includes a lot of important points about implementation. So the need for more time to balance contributions and roles, the need to build reflection points into project design to ensure flexibility as projects evolve. And obviously it's also important to make sure that there's adequate resources for that additional time and those kind of additional interpersonal kind of interactions that might be needed. And those resources should be factored into the project budget. We've also got a reflective tool on beginning collaboration, which can be used as a sort of a reflective or discussion tool for anticipating potential challenges and ensuring a project proposal or plan builds in opportunities for ongoing mutual learning, integration, knowledge sharing, and discussing and trying to reach agreement about outputs. And finally, another resource that is useful, I guess, in terms of the overall, those last few phases on writing a proposal is our top 10 tips on writing an interdisciplinary research proposal. And more, I think, in our section on improved research skills, you'll also find more useful material on this. So I will wrap up there and hand over to Catherine, who's going to talk about evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone, and I'm going to wrap up this session with a very quick look at really one of the core issues that comes up time and again when we start talking about interdisciplinary research, and that's how we evaluate it. I'm just posting the link to the toolkit again as a reminder in the chat. Please do play around with the toolkit as I'm talking. I am going to keep this fairly brief, so I want us to have plenty of time for questions. I should be able to advance my slides myself, thank you. When we think about evaluating inter and transdisciplinary research, there are a number of key considerations that mark this type of research out as quite different. First of all, we need to think about what we mean about quality in the context of research that spans many different disciplinary traditions. We often think about interdisciplinary evaluation less as a binary activity of the reviewer and the reviewed, but thinking about it in terms of more of a coaching process. We're very much at the learning stages about how to do interdisciplinary evaluation. We've talked a lot about integration this afternoon, and that's really central to a good interdisciplinary research project. We've also talked about some of the social factors. So actually the team building dynamics is really key. And it's that interaction of the social dynamics and the knowledge components of an interdisciplinary project that can really make for a successful research outcome. And that requires different things. It requires more time, as Darren and Isabel have highlighted. Above all, this is going to require a change in the peer review. I'd recommend some of Julie Klein's work. These bullet points come from a paper that she produced some years ago. So there are elements of good practice emerging in terms of how we go beyond simply assessing academic excellence, so that we think more about the quality of the integration. we think more in terms of building partnerships between the funders and the researchers. All of this has cost implications for funders, and it requires a greater degree of transparency if there are additional requirements. When I'm teaching, I emphasise that there is no one thing, there is no one research method that is interdisciplinarity. This goes back to Michaelis's question about how we understand the different definitions of inter and transdisciplinary research. Interdisciplinary research can take many different forms. It can have many different goals. So it's essential in the evaluation process that we understand what we're assessing. So, to summarise, the key challenges in the evaluation of interdisciplinary research. We need to recognise that it requires some special treatment, but at the same time we need to avoid creating additional burdens and hurdles for these types of researchers. All of this actually means that it's not possible to offer a single blueprint. We're not able to say to funding bodies, to national funders, follow this simple checklist and you will have a successful method for evaluating interdisciplinary research through peer review. So there is no one single model. Instead, what we're doing in the toolkit is providing a series of reflective guides. We're providing some checklists of things to consider, issues to consider. And we're looking at ways to build this into a tool that evaluators can use. The next step in this will be a conference session that we're organising in September with the ITD Alliance, where we're providing some parallel sessions showcasing both the innovative aspects of ITD, but specifically offering an invitation-only event for funders and policymakers to try and help us co-design some more evaluation guidelines, as well as a further discussion panel. We've talked about how you can help us in terms of how we promote the toolkit. We're definitely looking for your feedback in terms of how the toolkit might be used, in terms of how it could be used in different training activities, not just in this field of evaluation, but more broadly. And we would be very interested, as we said earlier in the conversation, to hear your advice on how we implement it and how we ensure its sustainability. So a very quick run through, really just giving you some explanation and background as to why we haven't given a simple checklist on evaluation and why that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. But hopefully the resources that you can find for yourself within the toolkit provide steps towards better understanding of what's needed when we come to evaluate inter and transdisciplinary research. And I'm going to hand back now to Kimberly, who will take us into the next Q&A session.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all very much for these quite informative and very, I think, exciting presentations. So it appears that we have two questions that have come in, and the first is once again coming from Elizabeth Osinski. And she would like to know if the Shape ID project has already been in contact, or if you've been in contact at all during this process with STEM researchers before actually writing these guides. Since you mentioned that there is a different language that they tend to speak, were they also addressed, or was it just SSH or ASSH researchers in this case?
That's a good question. Shall I start us off on that one, perhaps, Kimberly? I said at the beginning in the introduction that this is a coordination and support action. So what we're doing is we're synthesizing knowledge that exists. And there's a lot of good practice, there's a lot of knowledge about how to conduct inter and transdisciplinary research in the literature out there. And this is often based on case study material, people who are writing about their lived experiences of working in collaborations involving the HSS and STEM disciplines. So we are very much drawing on that kind of collective body of knowledge, not just of the work that we've done ourselves, but the work that we know others have done. And Bianca Vieni, our colleague from Zurich, led on Work Package 2, which did the literature review, bringing together the kind of existing corpus of knowledge with our colleagues from Poland as well in the team. So although we've perhaps had less direct contact over the last couple of years with STEM researchers, and we've been very much focusing on involving the arts, humanities and social sciences in our learning case workshops, for example, the toolkit is still very much embedded in that knowledge that has come from the STEM disciplines as well. So yes, I hope we are reflecting, and I hope we've put together a toolkit that will be useful for people from all disciplines. We were very conscious of trying to do that, and Isabel might want to come in on this. But we have given it slightly more of a steer towards the AHSS, given that we know they are so underrepresented at the moment in this type of research. So I don't know if colleagues want to add anything to that.
I wanted to add one brief thing. We talk about this, the language difference a bit when in the section, the goal on understanding inter and transdisciplinary research, and particularly that there are different labels for the same sort of collaborative practices. So we talk about the label team science, and some places just use collaborative science, and we link to those kind of resources. So team science is often used in particularly in the US in medical sciences, and we have team science resources in our toolkit. We wanted to make this toolkit as inclusive as possible where we found useful resources. So although we haven't talked to naturals, we haven't talked to many STEM researchers directly, we are using materials they have developed when we think they're relevant to the audiences that we are targeting.
Yeah, I was going to just add maybe two things to that. First of all, it's Shape ID is a collaborative project, and one of our partners, Christian Pohl, is an environmental scientist. He leads the TD lab in Zurich. So before we forget, he's a transdisciplinary expert, so we forget his disciplinary expertise, but he is indeed a STEM researcher. So we do have that expertise within the team to begin with. Also, I think I was just developing on the point that Isabel was making. A lot of the existing resources a lot of the transdisciplinary resources come from sustainability sciences. There's other areas that come out of, I think, maybe sort of medical sciences, some of the Australian resources like integration and implementation sciences. So in a sense, what we've been trying to do is take some of those existing resources and extract, the kind of clear lessons for them and almost translate them into a language that would be more accessible for arts, humanities and social science researchers. So we're trying to, in a sense, strip them of jargon in a way, so that we hope that, and of course in that process it's difficult not to create your own your own jargon, but we're trying to, I suppose, make them more accessible for a wider range of audiences. Of course, once you talk to STEM researchers about even something as simple as I discussed with STEM colleagues, the idea of the reflective tools, and they didn't understand the idea of reflexivity or reflectivity, and we had a lot of discussion about that, but there was no term that we could come up with that was satisfactory to everybody, so we sort of left it as it is for now. But I think there's definitely, it's core to interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, this problem of language and what we mean by things, and I hope we've sort of helped that process by making things less jargonistic in the sense of that the language isn't that embedded in particular disciplines, but that's very difficult to achieve. Acknowledge that.
Thank you for that. So another question comes once again from Michaelis, and he's actually wondering about the role of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary research in regards to the ERC, because he sees this as an area where it's actually not done very well. And he asked, what is the remit of interdisciplinary research or transdisciplinary research in basic and or frontier research, in your opinion? And how could we then change the excellence narrative that the ERC follows in order to increase IDR, TDR practices here?
Shall I start us off? I mean, I think this is such an important topic, and in fact, it's one I've been writing on recently. Our colleague Bianca Vieni, who works with us in Shape ID, and Julie Klein, who's one of our expert panel members, and I'm sure we're well known to some people in the audience. They're currently editing a collection for Routledge on international experiences in inter and transdisciplinary research. And the chapter I contributed from the UK perspective deals very much with this issue of the fact that this perpetual focus on research excellence actually discourages what people recognise as transdisciplinary research in the UK context, where, not to get too detailed about UK research policy, we are very hung up on the Research Excellence Framework, which assesses all British academics on the excellence of their scientific outputs. And that will often be detrimental to work that is perhaps more practical, more applied, more focused towards collaborations with external stakeholders. And so this really is a crucial point that I think is being debated at the moment within research policy circles. From a practical perspective, I think Michaelis is absolutely right. I mean, I've had conversations with my own colleagues at Edinburgh who were putting in applications to ERC and were struggling to try to work out which of the panels it would be best, because they felt they fell between two panels. I've had examples of this from other academics in Britain who talk about their experiences of going to these panels and not being seen as a proper biologist because they're actually doing something that's not seen as traditionally within the remit of the biological sciences disciplines. So I don't think we've got an answer to this at the moment, but I do think there is this debate, certainly in the UK, about the rhetoric that's constantly used around research excellence, and the fact that that means that we are always chasing a particular type of research, that we reward a particular type of research, and that's actually to the detriment of many other types of research, including inter and transdisciplinary research, but also the kind of what's called normal science, the work that goes on to ensure replicability of scientific discovery. We've actually recently heard the head of our UKRI, Otlin Laser, has been talking about this in the academic press. So I do think it's a current of conversation at the moment, but don't really have an answer to this for Michaelis, I don't think.
All right. So because we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to pose one final question to the group. And this comes from Dr. Anthony Flambard. And he asked if it's still possible to contribute to discussions on changing the jargon so that, these calls can be more accessible to all. And he's wondering, are there any sort of discussion groups, maybe kind of like these workshops that you had mentioned that the project had organized? Is anything still open to those who would be interested in helping to change the way these calls are being written?
Not sure what the answer is to that one, Anthony. I mean, I think perhaps from the national contact points perspective, it's about encouraging your research communities to contribute to these discussions, to encourage them to put themselves forward as evaluators. We know that the European Commission is always often struggling to find suitable evaluators. I'm less familiar with the process of how people get on to the sort of the call design panels, but I'm sure colleagues here in the audience will know about that. So how do we actually get people into the discussion room, into the policy room to influence the language that's being used? But I'm not sure that I'm really providing the answer that Anthony's looking for in this. I don't know if others want to come in, or yourself, Kimberly, whether you have a view on this.
I was just going to say it could be something that Network Society would look at because of their broad expertise in that area. So obviously, because Shape ID is ending, we don't have the opportunity. There's a lot of things we'd like to do, but we don't have the opportunity to set up discussion groups that can continue to contribute to that debate. But maybe it's something we can take up in the discussion afterwards. We're going to have a discussion, a more open discussion, switch from webinar format to meeting format next. yeah, we can have maybe a more back and forth discussion about those issues if you'd like, Anthony and others.
I would actually second that idea because now we are actually at the end of our webinar session. So once again, thank you all so very, very much for taking the time to be with us today and to provide us with this quite informative and insightful training on the toolkit that you've developed. I think it is an actually very useful tool, and it can be quite exciting to see how we're going to be able to promote its usage amongst our research communities. And as Darren mentioned, we will be moving in a minute to an extra session. Everyone is invited, and we actually really hope that you would be interested in attending because I could imagine that a number of interesting questions have been raised for you on how we can, for example, improve the language used in call text and what the next steps might potentially be so that we can, in fact, make this something that really does happen. So we have included a link to the next session in the chat. So we recommend that you please use that if you want to join us, and we will see you again in a few minutes. So thank you all very much today for being here. And the question came to me, yes, I believe Netflix Society would be very happy to continue this discussion and think about how we could mobilize just our resources to get feedback from our NCPs and our NCP network colleagues on how to improve just the way SSH integration is done. So thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again in a few minutes.